Forgotten. Chapter 5. Two and a half months had passed since Lucas and Paul began their training. Now, with their bodies hardened and their minds filled with clear orders, they had been sent to the battlefront. The calm before combat was suffocating. In the trenches, silence reigned. Only the sound of the wind and the scuff of boots on the wet earth could be heard. Lucas was breathing heavily, trying to control his nerves. Paul was at his side, with a confident smile, although his gaze betrayed the anxiety he felt. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the silence. A young soldier who had moved a few meters away from the trench stepped on a mine. The explosion was deafening. In an instant, the boy's body disintegrated in a macabre spectacle. His intestines flew out like snakes of flesh, while his limbs scattered through the air, falling into the trench as if they were broken toys. "Get down, Lucas!" Paul shouted as he pushed him to the ground. Chaos broke out. Gunshots rang out from all directions. Bullets whistled through the air, and explosions sent up clouds of dirt and blood. Paul, with chilling speed, grabbed one of the boy's severed arms that had been blown to pieces and lifted it over the trench. "Think it's one of us?" he shouted while throwing a grenade with his other hand. The explosion shattered the nearest enemy position, and the screams of Japanese soldiers filled the air. Lucas, shaking with adrenaline and rage, grabbed his rifle and stood up partially. Paul looked at him and shouted, "Now, Lucas, fire!" Lucas let out a war cry that echoed even above the roar of the bullets. He aimed and fired with precision, cutting down several enemies that tried to advance towards his position. Bodies fell like severed puppets, while blood soaked the ground. "Let's move forward," shouted Paul, stepping out of the trench with reckless bravery. Lucas followed him, firing relentlessly. In his mind there was only one thought: to survive. Every enemy that fell under his bullets was a momentary victory, but deaths continued to surround them. A Japanese soldier suddenly appeared in front of Lucas, bayonet in hand. Lucas reacted instinctively, hitting him with the butt of his rifle before shooting him at point-blank range. The enemy's body fell heavily to the ground, his eyes still open, as if he didn't understand that he was already dead. Paul, meanwhile, continued to throw grenades and fire. At one point, he grabbed a wounded enemy and used him as a human shield as he advanced to another position. "Is this all you have?" Paul shouted with a mixture of fury and despair. Lucas joined him, covering him with gunfire. Every step they took was a fight against terror, a race against the death that seemed to lurk around every corner. Finally, after what seemed like hours, they managed to secure their position. The ground was covered with bodies and human remains. Blood ran through the ditches like a river, and the smell of gunpowder and burning flesh was unbearable. Lucas, panting and with shaking hands, slumped against a rock. Paul sat beside him, wiping the blood and sweat from his face. "I told you, buddy," Paul said with a nervous laugh. "We got through this, and now there's only 1,000 more to go." Lucas didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. He knew that this was just the beginning, that every day in this war would be a battle not only against the enemy, but against his own humanity. The platoon continued to advance through the rough terrain, the sound of their boots crushing branches and wet leaves. Each step was a mixture of tension and fatigue, but the mission had to be accomplished. Lucas, observing the bodies of enemy soldiers who had fallen in combat, began to collect Japanese weapons and ammunition. "It's better to save ours," he said as he checked an Arisaka rifle. Paul, walking behind him, let out a laugh. "Seeing all that meat scattered on the floor made me think of something, buddy. You know what I want now? A damn juicy American hamburger." Lucas looked at him. Despite the horror of the day, he couldn't help but smile. Give me one with extra cheese and a nice cold soda. That would be heaven right now. The exhausted platoon reached a clearing in the woods where they decided to take a break before approaching the enemy line. They took out their canned rations and began to eat in silence. Everyone's faces were marked by fatigue and tension, but there was also a strange camaraderie in the air. One of the boys in the platoon, a young man named Andrew, was munching on a biscuit as he removed his helmet to rub his head. "This is as close to a feast as we're going to get here, guys," he said, trying to break the tension with a light comment. Suddenly, the whistling of a bullet cut through the air. In an instant, Andrew's head exploded like a ripe fruit, scattering skull fragments and brain matter across the ground. The soldiers' screams of horror filled the space. "Duck, Lucas! They're coming!" Paul shouted as he threw himself to the ground, dragging Lucas with him. The sound of gunfire filled the forest. Bullets whizzed everywhere, ripping bark from the trees and kicking up dust from the ground. The platoon reacted quickly, seeking cover and returning fire toward where the shots were coming from. Lucas, with the Japanese rifle he had picked up, began to fire with precision. The enemy soldiers were barely shadows among the trees, but each shot he fired was filled with rage and determination. Paul, at his side, threw a grenade towards an enemy position, which exploded with a deafening bang. "Damn bastards! Want to play? Come on, keep them coming!" he shouted, his voice filled with fury and adrenaline. The confrontation was fierce and chaotic. An enemy soldier rushed towards Lucas's position with a bayonet in hand, but Lucas reacted quickly, shooting him in the chest. The enemy fell to his knees in front of him, spitting blood before collapsing completely. "We have to move forward," the platoon leader shouted. "We can't stay here." With each shot and explosion, the platoon began to push forward, slowly advancing towards the enemy line. The forest had become a hellish battlefield, where death lurked in every shadow and the smell of blood and gunpowder was overwhelming. Lucas knew there was no time to process the horror of what he had seen. His mind was focused on surviving, on protecting the few remaining companions, and above all, on returning to Lori and Lily one day. The platoon continued to advance through the forest, leaving behind a trail of blood and lifeless bodies. The air was saturated with gunpowder and the metallic stench of death. Every step was a struggle for survival, every second a countdown to chaos. Suddenly, a Japanese soldier burst out from between the trees, launching himself at one of the men in the platoon with a deafening scream. His bayonet pierced the abdomen of a comrade, who let out a piercing scream before collapsing. Paul, with instinctive speed, raised his rifle and fired, hitting the enemy in the head. The Japanese fell backwards, leaving a trail of blood in the air as his body hit the ground with a dull thud. "Don't stop, Lucas. Let's keep moving," Paul shouted as he grabbed Lucas by the arm and pushed him forward. In the distance, the sound of gunfire and war cries grew louder. The platoon reached a clearing where a group of Japanese soldiers were entrenched. Without a second thought, Lucas threw a grenade into the enemy trench. The explosion raised a cloud of dirt and blood, throwing mutilated bodies in all directions. "That'll keep them quiet," Lucas shouted, his voice filled with anger. There was no time to celebrate, however. More enemy soldiers began firing from the flanks. A bullet grazed Lucas's shoulder, causing him to fall to the ground. Paul, seeing him wounded, rushed towards him, firing in all directions to keep the enemies at bay. "Get up, damn it! I'm not going to carry you," Paul shouted as he helped Lucas to his feet. Hand-to-hand combat began as the enemy broke through the lines. A Japanese soldier charged at Paul with a saber, but Paul dodged and struck him with the butt of his rifle, cracking his skull with a grotesque sound. Lucas, still recovering, took a knife from his belt and plunged it into another soldier's neck, feeling warm blood gush over his hand. The ground was covered with bodies and torn limbs. The platoon, reduced to less than half its men, managed to push the enemy back. "Lucas, Cover the left side, the platoon leader shouted as he fired towards the remaining enemies. Lucas, his nerves on edge, quickly reloaded his rifle and fired at a group of soldiers who were trying to surround them. One of them fell to his knees, holding the entrails hanging from his abdomen while screaming in an incomprehensible language. "They are overwhelming us! Let's retreat to the hill," the leader ordered. The platoon began to retreat, covering each other as the bullets continued to whistle around them. Paul, with a grimace of fury on his face, threw his last grenade towards the enemies before running after his comrades. Upon reaching the hill, the survivors regrouped, breathing heavily. Silence fell again over the battlefield, interrupted only by the moans of the wounded and the cracking of branches underfoot. Lucas looked at Paul, covered in blood and sweat, but with a spark of determination still in his eyes. "We're not done," Paul said gravely as he reloaded his rifle. "We won't until those bastards pay for everything," Lucas replied, gritting his teeth as his mind flashed back to his mother and father. The fight wasn't over, and Lucas knew it, but now more than ever, he was determined to keep going, no matter the cost. The camp had been quiet for 2 weeks, a respite from the chaos that had marked the previous days. The ground was clean, the trenches reinforced, and the men, though worn, kept up their spirits as best they could. An Allied plane flew overhead, dropping ammunition and supplies. The crates crashed to the ground with a crash, causing a moment of relief among the soldiers. However, the calm was shattered by the roar of a Japanese plane appearing on the horizon. The enemy aircraft, maneuvering like a stalking predator, unleashed a burst of gunfire that struck the Allied plane, splitting it in two in midair. Explosions lit up the sky as debris rained down on the camp. "Take cover!" the platoon leader shouted as the soldiers ran toward the trenches. The area was filled with chaos. A volley of bullets swept through the area, knocking down several men. Among them, the platoon medic fell to the ground, screaming in pain as he held his bloodied leg. Lucas and Paul ran toward him, dodging bullets and pieces of debris. "Damn it, the doctor's hurt!" Paul shouted as he pulled out his handgun. He placed it in the doctor's shaking hands and spoke firmly. "Come on, son of a If we're carrying you, at least shoot. Fart on those damn taka-taka." The doctor, pale-faced but determined, nodded and pointed his pistol at the approaching enemy figures. Lucas and Paul, meanwhile, lifted him up between them, holding him as they retreated toward the nearest trench. "Cover the left flank," Lucas shouted as he fired his rifle at the Japanese soldiers advancing through the smoke and fire. The doctor, although wounded, fired several shots. One of his bullets hit an enemy in the chest, knocking him to the ground. Paul couldn't stop laughing in the midst of the chaos, shouting between shots, "That's it! Show them what Americans are made of!" The firefight continued as the enemy lines came ever closer. One of the Japanese soldiers threw a grenade towards Lucas and the other's position. Without thinking, Lucas grabbed it and threw it back, exploding a few meters away and dismembering several enemies. Come on, you bastards! You have no idea who you messed with," Lucas shouted, feeling the rage burning inside him. The platoon managed to retreat to a safer position, leaving a trail of bodies and blood in their wake. Lucas and Paul placed the medic behind a makeshift barricade, where other soldiers began to give him first aid. "You did well, Doc. Now rest," Paul said, patting the medic on the shoulder, before returning to the fight. Lucas looked at the battlefield, now a hell of smoke, fire, and mutilated bodies. He gritted his teeth, reloaded his rifle, and ran into the line of fire. "We will not surrender. We will fight to the last man," he shouted, leading the platoon with a determination that seemed unstoppable. The battle continued, but Lucas and his platoon were determined to hold out, to fight for every inch of ground, even if it meant facing death face to face. The platoon continued to advance through the thick vegetation and the echo of distant gunfire. Their mission was clear: reach the hidden bunker that transmitted coordinates for airstrikes on Allied troops. The terrain was hostile, but the objective was too crucial to stop. Lucas, Paul, and the other soldiers kept their eyes fixed on the horizon, their weapons ready for any surprises. Finally, they reached the bunker. The structure was camouflaged among the trees, and the antennas stuck out like thorns in the gray sky. As they approached, they noticed 5 Japanese soldiers around the control tower. The enemy, seeing them surrounded, raised their hands in surrender. "Don't shoot," Lucas ordered, watching as the Japanese surrendered without resistance. However, a movement under a table caught Paul's attention, and he cautiously raised his gun. Before he could act, a Japanese soldier emerged from his hiding place and challenged the group in English. "We will not use weapons. Show us what you Americans are made of." The tension in the air became unbearable. Lucas, filled with pent-up rage over the death of his parents, was the first to accept the challenge. "All right, with bare hands," he shouted as he threw his rifle to the ground. The rest of the platoon followed suit, forming a circle around the Japanese soldiers. What followed was a feast of blood and uncontrolled violence. Lucas attacked with inhuman fury, knocking down his first opponent with a punch that broke his nose. Not satisfied, he grabbed him by the neck and slammed his head against the ground repeatedly, leaving a pool of blood. "This is for Mom!" he shouted as he punched another enemy. "This is for Dad!" Adrenaline became their driving force. Each blow was more brutal than the last. Each scream of their enemies fueled their thirst for revenge. The American soldiers, possessed by the frenzy of combat, seemed not to feel pain. If they did, that pain became fuel for their rage. One of the Japanese, seeing his side being massacred, grabbed a katana hidden in the room and charged towards Lucas. With a heart-rending scream, he brandished the sword with the intention of cutting him in two. "Lucas!" Paul shouted as he pulled out his pistol. In one swift movement, he shot the Japanese in the head before he could reach his friend. The enemy's blood splattered on the ground as his body fell limp. Paul, with a mixture of fury and sarcasm, leaned over the corpse and spat, "Damn Taka! We said no weapons, you cheating son of a The fighting continued until no Japanese were left alive. The bunker, now stained red, was a reflection of the brutality of war. Lucas, covered in enemy blood, leaned against the wall and tried to catch his breath. "We did it," he muttered, looking at Paul, who offered him his hand to help him up. "Of course, brother. But this isn't over," Paul replied as they both looked up at the control tower. The mission needed to be completed, and there was still work to be done. The sound of a plane broke the calm of the place. From above, the Allies were dropping ammunition, food, and supplies to the platoon. They had accomplished their mission, and although the war was still far from over, that night was theirs. The satisfaction of having eliminated the threat in the bunker gave them a respite, albeit brief, to regain their strength. The group made a makeshift camp near the tower. Lucas sat next to Paul, looking up at the dark, starlit sky. They were both exhausted, but the relief of having survived another day was evident on their faces. "Well, at least we have something to eat that's not canned," Paul said as he pulled out a packet of rations. "Yes, but I still miss burgers," Lucas replied with a bitter smile. The night wore on, and the rest of the platoon slept soundly. Paul, however, suffered from insomnia. Since they had arrived at war, quiet nights made him more nervous than days full of fighting. "I can't sleep, Lucas. I feel like something is going to explode at any moment." "Dude, relax. I'll take care of the guard tonight. Go to sleep before you go crazy." Paul looked at him, hesitating for a moment, but finally agreed. He pulled a piece of gum out of his pocket and chewed it as he lay down on the floor. "Okay, but if anything happens, yell at me," he said before closing his eyes. Lucas smiled and nodded, watching as his friend finally gave in to sleep. The silence of the night was almost disturbing. broken only by the sighs of the wind and the snores of some soldiers. But suddenly, a strange noise interrupted the calm. Cough, cough. Paul began to cough violently, sitting up abruptly. Lucas ran towards him, alarmed. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Paul, red-faced and watery-eyed, pointed to his throat as he continued to cough. Finally, he spat something out and dropped to the ground, breathing heavily. Lucas looked at the object and laughed. It was the gum that Paul had been chewing. "You're a fool, Paul," he exclaimed, laughing. "The Japanese didn't kill you, but you were almost killed by a stick of gum." Paul, still recovering, looked at him with a mixture of shame and anger. "Shut up, you moron. I was asleep. It wasn't my fault." Sure. Whatever you say, but this is too good to forget. When we get home, I'll tell everyone." Paul groaned, but couldn't help but smile at seeing his friend laughing so genuinely for the first time in weeks. "You know what, Lucas? If we get home alive, I promise to give up chewing gum and stick to burgers." "That sounds like a good plan. Now go to sleep, you idiot. Tomorrow will be another day of hell." Lucas returned to his guard post, while Paul, more relaxed this time, fell asleep. War was still a relentless monster, but moments like this reminded them that they were still human, capable of laughing and clinging to life, even in the midst of chaos. 4 months had passed since Lucas and Paul arrived in the war zone. Military bases were multiplying, as were the planes that roared in the skies, omens of more bloodshed. The battle was still intense, but Lucas and Paul were beginning to feel the weight of war on their bodies and souls. Both had earned nicknames that set them apart in the platoon. Lucas was called Bloodbag because, despite his ability to avoid death, he always ended up wounded in confrontations. Their uniforms, more than clothes, looked like canvases painted with their own blood. Paul, on the other hand, was known as the Madman. His risky maneuvers and maniacal laughter during combat made him feared by both enemies and his own comrades. One afternoon, while they were resting in a makeshift trench, Paul wiped the dried blood from his hands and looked at Lucas with a mixture of tiredness and resignation. "You know, I don't want to know anything about this damn war anymore. I don't even know how many Japanese I've killed, but I feel like every shot makes me less human." Lucas, leaning against a sandbag, sighed deeply. "I understand you. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever be the same again. There's more blood on my hands than I can remember, and even if I survive, I don't know if I'll be able to live with myself." Silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of planes. Suddenly, the sergeant appeared, running towards their position. "Bloodbag! Madman! I need my best men for this mission." They both stood up immediately, although fatigue weighed on every muscle. "What's up now, Sergeant?" Paul asked as he lit a cigarette. "We have information that the Japanese are planning a massive counterattack. We need to infiltrate their main base and sabotage their communications before they succeed." Lucas and Paul looked at each other. Neither wanted to continue killing, but both knew that war gave them no options. "We're in, Sergeant," Lucas replied firmly. The mission began at dusk. The team moved silently, advancing through the dense, humid jungle. Every step was calculated, every sound checked. When they reached the enemy base, they watched from a distance. It was a well-protected compound with Japanese soldiers patrolling every corner. "Ready, Loco?" Lucas asked as he loaded his rifle. Paul nodded, a crooked smile on his face. "I'm always ready. Let's give them the hell they deserve." The infiltration was swift and deadly. Lucas led the group, eliminating the guards with surgical precision. Paul, for his part, enjoyed every second, throwing grenades and making sarcastic comments. "Take this, you son of a he shouted as an explosive destroyed a watchtower. In the midst of the chaos, an enemy sniper fired, hitting one of the American soldiers in the chest. Blood splattered Lucas, who roared in fury and fired at the enemy until he emptied his magazine. "This is for Mom, for Dad, and for everyone we've lost," he shouted as he made his way to the center of the base. Finally, they managed to reach the communication center. Paul placed explosives on the equipment while Lucas covered their position. 5 minutes, and this thing will blow up. Let's go, Paul shouted. The group retreated as the crossfire increased. Just as they left the base, the explosives detonated, sending out a shock wave that lit up the night sky. Back at the American base, the soldiers were greeted as heroes, but Lucas and Paul felt no joy. "We are becoming more and more machines and fewer men," Lucas said as he cleaned his rifle. "Maybe we always were, buddy," Paul replied, lighting another cigarette. They both sat in silence, looking at the stars. They knew the war wasn't over, but at that moment they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Days later, as Lucas and Paul rested at a makeshift base in the hills, Lucas received an unexpected letter. The envelope was stained with a bit of mud, and the corners were bent from use. With shaking hands, Lucas broke the seal and began to read anxiously. It was Laurie's. "My dear Lucas, I've been thinking a lot about you and everything we've been through together. The war has separated us in many ways, but I'll always carry you in my heart. I've had to make a very difficult decision, but I feel like it's time to share something important with you. Lucas, I'm pregnant. Yes, we're expecting a child. I don't know how you'll take this news, but I want you to know that I'll do the best I can for both of us. I don't know how things will change, but I promise you that I'll be here, waiting for you, fighting for our future. I hope that when you come back, we can be the family we always dreamed of. I love you more than ever, and you'll always be in my thoughts, even on the darkest days. With all my love, Laurie." Lucas stared at the letter, unable to fully process what he had just read. The sound of war, of planes and explosions, suddenly seemed distant. It was as if the world around him had vanished for a moment. His heart was pounding, mixing a feeling of despair with a hope that he himself did not understand. A son. A child growing up in the world he was leaving behind, in a future that might not exist for him. A child, he whispered to himself, the words echoing in his mind like a distant sound. But that hope, and that tiny spark of something worthwhile, gave him strength he didn't know he still had. Paul, seeing him so thoughtful, approached him and asked him in a mocking but worried tone, "What's up, buddy? Did your girlfriend's letter leave you speechless?" Lucas looked up, his face serious. His eyes, normally hard and filled with rage, now held a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "It's Laurie's. She's pregnant. We're going to be parents." Paul was silent for a moment, looking at his friend. He knew the war had robbed them of everything, but now, with those words, Lucas had something he never thought he would have in the midst of the carnage: a future. "That changes everything, doesn't it?" Paul said, his tone more serious now. Lucas nodded slowly. He ran his hand over his face, trying to calm himself. "I don't know how, but I have to survive. I have to get out of here, Paul. For Laurie, for our son. I can't let all this be in vain." Paul looked at him with a mixture of respect and sadness. He knew what that meant, and he knew that war was a life-devouring machine, but if Lucas found something to fight for, something beyond death and destruction, maybe he could move on. "I promise you, my friend, you're going to make it. And when we get out of here, the first thing we're going to do is celebrate that son. For Laurie, for you. For all those we've lost." Lucas gritted his teeth, taking a deep breath. "Yes, I will. I will do it for them. And for me." That night, as the platoon slept, Lucas couldn't sleep. The letter was still in his hand, Laurie's words still dancing in his mind. A son, a new life, a new purpose. The war could steal everything from him, but it couldn't take away that hope. And even though the bombs were falling on the horizon, Even though the war continued to claim lives and separate families, Lucas clung to that small light in the darkness. His future. His son. Lucas approached the lieutenant with determination, his face marked by fatigue and worry. His uniform was dirty, torn by months of combat and long days on the battlefield. His mind, however, was focused on one thing: Lori and the child that was about to arrive. The letter he had received kept turning around in his head and giving him strength, but also an unbearable weight on his shoulders. "Sir," Lucas said, his voice firm but with a hint of desperation, "I want to leave the war. I need to go to my wife. She is pregnant. I need to be there. I can't stay here." The lieutenant, a man with a stern face and a calculating gaze, looked at him for a few seconds, assessing the situation. He knew that Lucas was one of the best soldiers in his platoon, someone who had survived the worst, who had faced death on every corner of that cursed island. But he also knew that the war did not stop for anyone, not even for the promises of a son. "Lucas," the lieutenant said, his tone authoritative, "congratulations on the news. You're going to be a father. But you must understand something, son. You can't leave in the middle of a war, not now." Lucas looked at him, feeling a wave of frustration wash over him. "Sir, I don't care what you say. My family needs me. My child is about to be born. I can't keep fighting for a country that gives me nothing but death. I want to go to my wife, to Lori. I wanted to help her raise our child." The lieutenant sighed and walked over to the table where several maps and radios rested. He took a cigarette, lit it slowly, and stared at it. Lucas was waiting for an answer, but the lieutenant knew the words couldn't be simple. It wasn't a personal decision. It was a matter of survival, of duty. "I understand your desperation," he said finally. "But you and I both know that you signed a contract that binds you to this war until the end. You can't leave, Lucas. You have two missions now. The first is to kill Japanese. The second is to survive. If you want to see your wife and your son someday, if you want to go home, you'll have to fulfill them." Lucas felt as if an explosion had shaken his body. The memories of the war, the screams, the deaths, everything he had suffered, everything he had lost, seemed to be overshadowed for a moment by that cruel reality. The lieutenant was right. The war did not stop. No one stopped. And the only way to return home was to keep going, keep killing, keep fighting. "I understand, sir," Lucas replied, his voice empty, as if everything he was thinking no longer made sense. "But I have to do it. I can't stay here. I can't keep killing endlessly, knowing that my family needs me." The lieutenant looked at him for a moment longer, as if assessing his loyalty, his resolve. Then he stepped back and nodded. "Then do it right. Kill them quickly. And if you want to see her again, if you want your son to grow up knowing his father was willing to do anything for him, then survive it. War isn't about justice or nobility, Lucas. It's about who survives in the end. You can't afford to lose. Not now. Not after everything you've been through." Lucas felt the weight of the lieutenant's words crushing him. What he was asking of him was more than difficult. It was a sentence he couldn't escape. But he also knew the lieutenant was right. He couldn't let everything he had suffered be in vain. He had to move on, for Lori, for his son, for himself. "I will, sir," he said finally, clenching his fist tightly, his gaze hardening. "I will do it for him." The lieutenant nodded in satisfaction. "Then get ready. We have 2 more bunkers to destroy, and the mission is clear. If you want to get back to your family, you need to survive what's coming." Lucas left the office, his mind filled with confusing and painful thoughts. The war continued, and so did he. The thought of his son, of Lori became a beacon in the midst of the darkness. But he also knew that the path to them was paved with more blood, more death. He would have to face whatever remained on the horizon, no matter the cost. When he stepped outside, he saw Paul waiting at the entrance, staring blankly at the horizon. Lucas approached him, his lieutenant's words still echoing in his mind. "We're going to complete the mission, Paul," Lucas said, his voice hard now, as if he had left behind the person he had been before receiving the letter. "There are 2 bunkers left, and we're going to destroy them. If I want to see Lori and my son, I can't let this get me down." Paul looked at him and nodded, understanding without words. They both knew that war was not a game, and that survival was the only law that mattered. "Let's get this over with," Paul said, loading his gun. "After this, buddy, after this, we're going home." They both entered the darkness of war, aware that each step they took brought them closer to death or survival. But the only thing that mattered now was survival.